all the way down to the southern row of counties in the state, where many of those farmers actually sneak across the border into northern Illinois to get a hold of some early 3.0 beans. So again, we have a lot of diversity in Wisconsin in terms of what we do. We also have very high yield potential. Most of my, I'd say 2/3 of my research locations are on farmer fields. As you can see down on the Platteville side, had an average yield of 82 bushels per acre. But this last year we had bushels, we had soybean varieties pushing almost 100 bushels per acre in several locations. So again, just like to give the growers that aren't familiar with me kind of an idea of my program and how we operate. And again, I don't know how many of you have been around for a while, but I was actually the small grain specialist at Mizzou down in Columbia from 2001 to 2004. So I do have a little bit of experience working in Missouri and had research stations up at Novelty and other locations across Missouri. So again, just a little bit of understanding of who I am and where I came from. One of the things that we get to do as part of my program is look at these different trait platforms as they come out. And again, if you can see here, again, looking at this, if you look across the entire state of Wisconsin, we see here that the Roundup Ready to extend across the entire state yield a little bit higher than the E3 beans. If you look at a statewide basis, but we did see some regional differences. I just bring this to your attention so you get an idea of how these platforms perform against. So again, these trait platforms offer different opportunities for controlling weeds, but I always want to remind growers to really dig into it and pay specific attention to varieties, because in our variety testing program, we can see up to a 20 bushel yield difference between the highest yielding variety and the lowest yielding variety. So really pay attention to genetics and varieties from both the local markets, but also more of a regional area, because as many of you know, when I first started this job here in Wisconsin, probably about 15 years ago, we would have varieties hanging around 3 to 4 years. Now we're lucky to see the same variety hang around for up to 2 years. We see a lot of transition, a lot of genetic advancement. So pay specific attention, not just how varieties performed on your farm, local area, but how that variety performed across a wider area to give you as a farmer a better idea of the predictability of how that genetics will perform, because we don't really know what the environment's going to be next year. So hopefully that makes sense, and I will keep going. As of Jody had indicated earlier, I have a research appointment, but everything that I do gets pushed out on my extension platform. My website is www.coolbean.info. And my Twitter handle, if anyone's interested in following me on Twitter, I'm @BadgerBean. So every research paper I publish gets transitioned into an extension format specifically targeted at farmers. And I try to kind of give the synopsis of the top 3 things that we learned, so you don't get bored reading through pages and pages of information. So again, check it out, my website. And again, if you look here, you can go to the soybean research drop-down box, see everything we do on the soybean side of things. And the small grains, specifically, we're targeting there mostly oat and soft red winter wheat. So basically the same class of wheat grown across most of the state of Missouri. Years ago, we took the opportunity to redraw the maturity group maps across the country. I don't know if you get here, see here in Missouri, you see this line, there's a 4-0. So right there, if you follow that black line, basically shows what the optimal maturity group for yield would be. We've seen a lot of changes, mainly in the northern part of the United States, mainly because of we're planting earlier. Breeders have changed the phenology, or basically the physiology of soybeans over the last 3 years. And it's pretty interesting to note that soybeans now, today's modern genetics, they'll flower about a week earlier than they did, 15, 20 years ago. And specifically in Missouri, when we get into the maturity group 3 and 4 beans, what we'll see is they remain reproductive from 10 to 14 days longer. And what that really allows farmers to do is take advantage of the phenotypic plasticity or the phenology of that soybean plant to kind of help catch some of these August rainfalls. And specifically even now, because we're extending the time frame that these plants are basically reproductive into early September. So I think it's really important to note that how breeders have changed the plant in a sense without them really knowing it helps us kind of fine tune our agronomic recommendations, knowing that that plant is going to be reproductive 10 to 14 days longer. And I think that's also important if we're targeting some of these yield limiting factors, such as foliar fungicides for diseases, because I know frog eye can be an issue down in Missouri. That knowing that that plant is going to be reproductive 10 to 14 days longer really helps us get a sense of how to time and keep that plant as productive as possible to take advantage of that extra time frame. So talk about what drives soybean yield, specifically what those basically what those yield components are. And the reason for that is I really like to encourage farmers to think about whatever input or product they're putting into their operation, how that can really influence soybean yield. And what I mean by that is we'll kind of walk through this a little bit. So in terms of the yield components, and if we were live, I would put 4 farmers on the spot and ask this question, but it's kind of hard in a virtual format. So if you think about what drives yield, the first thing is population. All right, we need a base population out there just to get enough plants out there to maximize yield. And in most situations, what we're really targeting is, in an early planted, not really double crop situation, that'd be a little bit higher population, but in an early planted, late April, early May, we want to target 100,000 plants at harvest. Okay, that usually allows us to maximize yield in most situations. If we're talking about a double crop situation, I'd rather see 140 to 160,000 plants per acre out there at harvest to maximize yield. Again, the reason for that is there's a shorter growing season and just make sure we get enough pods and seeds per unit area. So the first thing we're targeting is basically the base population. How do we influence base population? It's the seeding rate we put out there, it's the seed treatments that we may put out there just to make sure we get that base 100,000 plants per acre to start with. The next thing we're looking at is basically pods per unit area. How do we maximize pods? A lot of that has to do with planting date and being able to look at strategies to alleviate stress. We have the pods per unit area, then we're having seeds per pod, and then seeds per unit area. So again, that's all kind of adds up. And I forgot last one, seed size. And these kind of all add up to really maximize yield. So the point I want to make with this slide is if you're thinking about inputs, and if that input does not directly influence how many plants per unit area, how many seeds per pod you have, how many seeds per unit area, and seed size, and that input really is not helping you as a farmer. So again, as you're thinking about making these input decisions on an annual basis, just think about how it directly influences one of those yield components on soybeans. But with that being said, I always get the question every year, specifically around harvest time, is there a good model out there to predict soybean yield? And I think I've come up with the best model I've ever seen to this point. It's you start with 50 bushels, and then it's the standard error is plus or minus 50 bushels. And that gets about 95% of the yields out there. So again, if you're thinking about estimating soybean yield, I think that's as good a model as I've been able to come up with to date. So, all right. Now, what I want to do is kind of get into this topic that Jody asked me to discuss, which is this yield gap. And just to give you a brief update on the yield gap, what that really is. So basically, you have the genetic potential out there, all right? And I would argue for Missouri, it's probably in that 120 to 130 bushels per acre. I would say would be a base genetic yield potential for northern Missouri, central Missouri, okay? Then what you have is your potential yield given what your environment allows it to do. I mean, we always have that genetic yield potential, but then we have the potential yield, which would probably be in a great season in that 90 to 100 bushels. And then what we have is the actual yield. Now, I'm not off the top of my head 100% certain what it is in Missouri. I think it's right around 50 to 52 bushels per acre, if I remember correctly. So again, if your potential yield is 100 and your actual yield is 50, that difference between 50 and 100, that 50 to 48 bushels is what we call the yield gap. And that's a way that we can need to think about how to develop strategies to minimize that yield gap, okay? So things we did is we got funding through the North Central Soybean Research Program to be able to look at how do we minimize this yield gap across the North Central region. What we were able to do is we went out and sent these surveys out to farmers. So we were able to ask farmers specifically on their farm, what was their planting date, what variety did they use, what seed treatment did they use, what what was their herbicide program, what were the traits they used. We were able to really get a good handle on what farmers were doing on their farm, okay? And we were able to actually get 8,000, a little over 8,000 farmers to send us their data. Here you see every one of those red dots is a specific farmer who delivered us data. So you see there we have about 8,000 farm fields and roughly over 600,000 acres of data in our database. Now, I think many people will notice we don't have a ton of data from Missouri, but that's okay, because what I'll do is I'll kind of explain how we sorted this data out, and we were actually able to capture some data specifically for the northern third of the state based on this statistical process. So the question that I get from farmers is, so you have 8,000 farmers, let me go back a slide, from all over the Midwest. How can you possibly have any clue and make any statistical ideas about how what one farmer does influences another farmer? Because every single one of you on the call does something different. Different variety, different herbicide program, a different fungicide program, seed treatments across the board. So how do we sort this out? One of the cool things that farmers did is they allowed us to go in and they gave us the GPS locations for. We went into Google Maps, we drew these boundaries, and then we sucked that data into our database, all right? Then what we were able to do is go in and take all of the information from the different soils conditions, the weather environments, and we defined these areas under what we call TEDs. And these are technology extrapolation domains. If you see here in Missouri, you'll see this red coloration here. So what we see is a similar TED from the southeast part of Iowa all the way reaching down into Missouri, and specifically in the southwest part too. So anytime you see colors that are similar, that means these farmers lie within a similar yield environment, or as we classify it as a TED. That way it allows us to take that 8,000 farm fields and extrapolate that across the entire North Central region. And we roughly have data then that covers right around 65% of all the acres. So that's a huge amount of acres that we've been able to classify and characterize for different management strategies to increase yield, as well as minimize that yield gap that we discussed earlier. So I'm going to quickly kind of come in and talk about a few of the main drivers of yield. And this is specifically one of the most important ones. I mean, I think any agronomist worth their salt, the first thing they're going to talk about is genetics. It doesn't matter if it's corn, soybean, wheat, whatever. And what's the number two thing we're going to talk about? Probably planting date. All right. So we're going to dig into this planting date issue a little bit. Now, remember earlier, we didn't see a lot of data from Missouri, but if you look here in this map, we see we have a big chunk of the upper third of Missouri. I live below the I-70, so I usually refer to it as Missouri because I was below the Mesa-Dixon line. But we see here these different colorations. And if you see this purple color right here, that would be one technology domain. So that would be TED 6R, all right? So according to that, if you are a farmer that lives in a geographic region with that purple coloration, you lose 0.2 bushels per acre per day you delay planting past roughly that April 24th planting date, all right? Now, if you live in this green coloration right here, that would be TED 2R. And in that area, you're losing about 1.5 bushels per acre per day you delay past that planting date. So it allows us, as agronomists and growers to get a better handle on what that delay is for planting date. All right. So it really helps us understand how big of a driver it is. Because in some of these areas, these TED like 1R, they're losing up to half a bushel per acre per day by delaying planting date past that April 24th planting date window. So again, gives growers a sense that we can help identify what works on your farm based on the geographic region, i.e. that TED that you're farming on. So we always get this question about why does planting date matter so much in soybean? And actually, it's pretty simple. It's what I consider about the only free yield you as a farmer can capture. And what we see behind that, or the physiology driving behind this, is typically as we plant earlier, we get anywhere from 1 to 3 nodes per plant based on a given growing season. All right. So then if you average 3 pods per node, 3.3 seeds per pod times 3 nodes, that's kind of where the math just falls into place, is where we see that 3 to 8 bushel yield increase, depending on which TED you're in, is based on how many nodes, how many pods per node, and how many seeds per pod. So that's kind of the simple math behind why we see this yield advantage. And one of the cooler things that we've noted over time, and again, it's really unbeknownst to breeders, but they've effectively bred soybeans to have a higher yield potential from earlier planting with today's modern genetics than the genetics they released 20 years ago. What's interesting to note is breeders really haven't specifically targeted these early nurseries, specifically in their early generations, because they don't want to lose them to frost or flooding or things like that. So breeders really haven't directly tried to push for this, but indirectly, just through their breeding efforts, today's modern genetics have a higher yield potential by planting early. So again, I could show you a paper, but that would make you all fall asleep, and we really don't want to do that today. But that information could be found on my website. Now, the question is, why do we see this variability? All right, why do we see this challenge of, in some TEDs we have half a bushel per acre per day yield gain, yield loss by delaying planting, whereas some of them we have 0.15. And this is the reason right here. It comes down to do with the water balance in these fields. So remember, let's go back to that 6R. All right. So in the 6R TEDs, which would be the purple colorations, just as a reminder that if you fall into that, basically on average in 6R, farmers in those locations are running 2.5 inches behind in terms of what the water balance would be to maximize yield. All right. So if you're a farmer that lives in TED 6R, on average, you're running 2.5 inches behind what you would need to maximize yield. But if you were a farmer that was in TED 6R and had the capacity to irrigate and make up those 2.5 inches of basically negative water balance, then you'd be pushing up near that 0.45 to 0.5 bushel per acre per day yield penalty. So again, not sure how much of the irrigation is done in your specific area, but if you are irrigated, that really helps drive that point home, that you can make up for that, and then you'll be pushing that half a bushel per acre per day yield loss by delaying planting past April 24th. So I'm probably not supposed to do this, but I'm going to pause for one quick second and ask if there's any questions or a question, because I always speak really fast, and I'm always accused of putting 10 pounds of manure in a 5-pound sack. So if there's any quick questions, I'll pause. Otherwise, I'll keep rocking and rolling.
Jacob, have any questions come in so far?
We haven't seen any questions come into the chat yet. If anybody has questions, absolutely feel free to enter them in the chat, or ask Dr. Conley now.
All right. Well, what I'll do is I'll pause in a little bit again to see if there's anything pops in. All right. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on crop rotation. There's just a couple quick points I want to make as we get through here. In Wisconsin, we see a clear crop rotational benefit. And in Wisconsin, we see the corn, soybean, wheat rotation in that specific sequence to be the best rotation. I do know that in Missouri, you have the capacity to do a corn, wheat, double crop soybean. Again, that's probably the optimal one there. But the point I want to make here is for a given region and area, there are optimal rotational systems, and the order does matter. So I just want to bring that up for thought among the group here. The other thing I want to really kind of talk about is how tillage plays a role in some of this. First of all, if you're in a corn soybean rotation, we really don't see a big advantage of conventional till versus no till. I mean, basically what we see is it's pretty much a wash. If you're in a corn soybean rotation, tillage doesn't matter. All right, you can go no till or you can go conventional till, and we see a very similar yield. The point here I like to make is kind of interesting is that you can see how quickly disease populations build up in a soybean system. And basically, because we get this question, every time the corn price stinks and the soybean price is good, is how many years can I grow beans on beans? Okay, and usually by the third year of growing soybeans, all right, you're at similar yield potential of 30 years of continuous soybeans. So this 49 bushels per acre, this is our average yield after 30 years of growing beans in the same ground. This 51, this is how quickly you can go and move us from the 56 in a corn soybean rotation, and we can drive that down after 3 years of continuous soybeans and are basically at what the 30-year level is. So the point I always want to make here is just remind farmers of how quickly planting beans on beans gets us to that point where we're specifically at that load of 30 years of continuous soybeans. Okay, now again, this is kind of a funky graph, but a couple of things I want to kind of point out, and we'll specifically target this till no till sign. So if you go up here into this letter A on the upper left-hand corner, this here in the X and Y axis, we have the difference between a till farmer in a specific TED and a no-till farmer in a specific TED. All right, here we are. This is the black one-to-one line. All right, what that means is if a farmer, like a TED, specific TED lies on the one-to-one line, like this TED does right here, this would be 8I. Doesn't really matter what you do. If you are till or no till, your yield is exactly the same. However, if for here, I saw many of the farmers on the phone may live in TED 6R. Again, TED 6R is right here. As you can see, it lies right on the one-to-one line. In that situation, again, doesn't matter. If you till or no till, yield is going to be exactly the same. And where do we get this data? Remember, this is data from those 8,000 farmers and that 600,000 acres of data. So it's a pretty robust data set. Now, on the flip side, if we have some farmers here in this red, okay, excuse me, not red, I must be colorblind today, this green area, that again is 2R. And this 2R we see is statistically different. So in TED 2R, what we see is roughly a 2 to 3 bushel yield advantage, okay, in a tilled system versus a no-till. So again, what this allows farmers to really get a sense is, based on their soils and their climate and their environmental conditions, where do they see a difference? Now, the question is, as a farmer, excuse me, in TED 2R, can you make a tillage operation? And I'm guessing that's right about that 3 bushels. It's cheaper than 3 bushels. So if we use $9 beans, can you do a tillage operations for $27 or less? And that's the question. I think most of you probably could do that. So it's just a point I just wanted to bring across to those that we can really see a difference between these TEDs versus 6R. Doesn't matter what you do. TED 2R is roughly a 3 bushel yield advantage to tillage. All right, no-till, kind of fly through this just to keep myself on pace. Now, a couple slides before we talked about the differences about rotational system and how many years of continuous soybean. You may have remembered that I had said in a typical corn soybean rotation, there's no difference between till and no-till. However, when we get into these continuous soybean systems where we're planting beans on beans on beans, there we see the advantage to tillage. All right. So again, did we see these tillage by rotational sequence interactions come into play? So I just want to make sure I brought that to your attention, because I do know there are some acres in northern Missouri that see continuous soybeans on an annual basis. So that we might be able to see where this tillage component comes in if you are growing beans on beans on beans. So hopefully you can see the caveats play out and why it's kind of cool to have this big data approach and be able to look at all this information that farmers are delivering to us and trusting us, trusting their data with us. So I just think this is a cool data set, and trust me, there's a lot of people trying to get their hands on this, but the good thing is, A, we don't turn it over, and B, I'm going to be publishing on this for 20 years. So by the time I'm done publishing, no one will want to use it. So that's good for me and bad for them. All right. Now, I'm going to pause for one quick second, catch my breath, and kind of talk about this whole drainage situation. Because I do know we were able to work with Kelly Nelson at Novelty, and we really want to kind of get an idea of what advantage this artificial drainage versus no drainage has. And as you can see here in Missouri, we're able to capture quite a bit of different variability with these different TEDs. And a couple things to note, and many of you farm this land, so you probably know it better than I do. But what we really see is anywhere, and you can see these green X's right here, that is Missouri data. So that's from the Novelty Research site. What we see is up to, and I'm sorry, this is metric. I didn't get a chance to turn this into English units, but roughly we're seeing up to an 8 to a 10% yield advantage to artificial drainage, i.e. drain tile, in parts of northern Missouri. So this is experimental data coming from the Novelty Research Station. Here is data coming from farm fields, and we saw those TEDs, and we're seeing the same thing, roughly 4 to 10% yield advantage based on the TED for putting some of this drainage into place. So again, I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but just really showing the advantage of the yield advantage of how putting tile in place can really improve soybean yield over the long term in many parts of the country, and even including northern Missouri. All right. I'm going to give it a quick pause again before I go into seeding rate. Does anyone have any questions? Did anything pop in?
Yes, so Sean, there was a question, just for clarification. What TED would the counties on the east side of Iowa, right along the river, fall?
All right, let's go back. Sorry, I should have guessed there were some Iowa people on here as well.
Yes. We would have a decent chunk of the group that would be from the kind of the southeast portion of Iowa as well.
So what this map doesn't show all of it. It's kind of hard to get the resolution. But what I'll do is I will share the research report with Jody, if that's fine with everybody, and he can email it out. And I basically have the entire state of Iowa painted. So we did get a lot of data out of Iowa, so you'll be able to kind of dig into your TED specifically with that report. Is that fine for the audience, or do you want me to go to it now?
I think that would be fine, Dr. Conley.
Yep.
We can, if you're okay with it, we could post it on our team Facebook page. Are you okay with that?
Oh, you bet. Everything I do is open for dissemination, so feel free to post as you will. Yeah,
Perfect.
we were very fortunate. We worked with the Iowa Soybean Association on the on-farm network, and we got a lot of Iowa painted, so they were very beneficial and helpful. All right, so now let's get into some questions related to seeding rate. Again, this is probably one of the Top 3 questions I get asked in every meeting, you know, what date should I plant? What row spacing should I plant? And what should my seeding rate be? So what really has helped to drive this question is now that we have the capacity for this variable rate seeding, it's very easy and simple these days to basically just plug in a variable rate program and just let her fly. So one of the things we're able to do is get and aggregate a whole bunch of data from across the Midwest. And I'll quickly go through. And again, I have a whole research report on Cool Bean if I talk too fast, which I always do. So you can kind of go in and dig into this more. But knowing that we are mainly in Missouri and Iowa here, we'll focus on cluster 3. So cluster 3 are these green dots, all right? So what we did is we classified growing environments based on a similar idea as this TED technology, okay? What we did within each cluster environment, we characterized it as being a low yield environment, which would be under 58 bushels per acre, a mid yield environment, 58 to 71, and a high yield environment, 71 to 111 bushels. So as you're a farmer thinking about this and understanding your own field system, just as I discussed this, kind of I'll point out these different yield environments, low, medium, or high. All right, and we're not going to worry about math. One of the cool things we noticed is that in a high yield environment, and we're going to go back to, remember, in a high yield environment, we're going to go into these different classifications, and basically we see no relationship between stand and yield, either early season stand or late season stand in a high yield environment. All right, it's kind of interesting to note. If you're in this low yield environment, we do see a positive and significant relationship between stand, i.e., as stand increases in a low yield environment, you know, we typically see a higher yield. And that's kind of just the opposite of what we always think about with corn. Typically in a low yield environment, farmers will drop fewer seeds or, you know, corn seeds. Or in soybeans, you flip it, okay? You drop fewer seeds in a high yield environment and you drop more seeds in a low yield environment. All right. And we'll kind of get into what those actual seeding rates are in a second here. All right. I'm going to show you 2 different figures here. All right. This is the agronomic optimal seeding rate. And since most of the farmers on here are in cluster 3, we see here the agronomic optimal seeding rate basically doesn't change in cluster 3. So basically anywhere from 130,000 to 140,000, you know, those numbers, there's some error in there. That's why there's a little bit of differences. But what that tells you is in cluster 3, regardless of what your quote unquote yield environment is, should be dropping right around that 130 to 140,000 seeds. We don't see a lot of variability that we would see in more of a northern climate that we get into in Wisconsin and North Dakota. So this is agronomic optimal. If we look at economic optimal, we see a little bit of a different story, but kind of similar in that in cluster 3, which you are all in, very similar type of environment. Again, these numbers have a little bit of variability, but I would strongly encourage farmers to kind of play around with what that seeding rate should be. So next question, and I know farmers are always interested in, is what is the risk? Okay, we've tried to classify this information to farmers based on their own risk level. So here we are. Here's our risk analysis of our seeding rates. This is agronomic optimal seeding rate in a high yield environment in cluster 3. So basically, your agronomic optimal seeding rate in cluster 3, high yield environment, would be 142,000 seeds per acre. If you increase your seeding rate 10%, there's basically a 55% probability that you'll have a higher yield. All right. If you decrease it, there's a 38% chance you'll have a higher yield. So this gives farmers an idea of what that risk would be in terms of driving yield. And this, remember, this is agronomic. We'd see a different risk for economic, but again, go to my website and you can download this. And what I'll do is I'll share this publication with Jody too, and he can post this on the Facebook account as well. Now, one of the things that we have developed at UW-Madison is what we call the Bean Cam. So this is a free app sponsored by the Wisconsin Soybean Marketing Board. You can download it either on Google Play if you have an Android, or the Apple Store if you have an iPhone. All right. All you do is you go through, you select what growth stage your beans are at, what row spacing your beans are at, and you hold your camera over the rows like this and you snap a picture. This is what you see on your phone. This is what your camera sees. So the one thing I'll note is, what don't you see between these rows? You do not see weeds, because my app does not differentiate between weeds and soybeans. So make sure your beans are weed free at this point. And if you look at all of the data showing the critical period for basically weed free period would be V2 anyhow. So in short, you shouldn't have any bean weeds out there at V2 soybeans because you're getting yield loss at that point. But I digress. I'm not going to talk about weed management at this point. So what you do then, there's one of my graduate students, Marion Lund, going through, walking around. She snapped 5 pictures. Okay, it goes in the app. You get this average count per picture, and what it gives you is an estimate of yield. So basically what we said is, you have a stand out there of 80,000 plants per acre, and that gives you 97% of your maximum yield. All right. If you as a farmer wanted to replant, we suggested replant rate would be roughly 60,000 seeds per acre, and your percent max yield would be 98%. So I would argue that as a farmer, even if, and I'm not familiar what Asgrow's replant or rules are, but I would argue that even if you get free seed, you can't pay someone enough. You can't pay someone to go out and physically have wear and tear in your equipment to pay for a 1% yield gain. All right. My rule of thumb, and we have data to support this, is anywhere between, so you need 100,000 plants per acre to maximize yield on an early planted environment. Between 100,000 and 50,000 plants per acre, don't touch it. All right. And I understand water hemp's a challenge and weed control is a challenge, but we've modeled, we've taken pictures, and you can get a stand as low as 50,000 plants per acre that is planted early or on time, and it will canopy. It will give you 100% canopy. It just takes a week to 10 days longer. So I'd much rather have you as a farmer go out there and add an additional herbicide pass with some residual herbicide. Would be better and more economic than trying to go through and put seed out there that really is only going to give you 1% yield advantage or yield gain. If you as a farmer's plant stand is less than 50,000 plants per acre, then I encourage farmers to go in and plant directly into an existing stand. Do not start over, because remember, those 50,000 plants that were out there have a higher yield potential because they were planted 2 to 3 weeks earlier than by the time you get out there to replant than anything you're going to seed after. And again, I have that information, and I will send that link to Jody as well. So that's 3 things that I've promised Jody, and let's see if I'll remember that when I'm done here today. But I'll send it as soon as I'm done talking. I'll pause here because this is usually where I get questions. The funny thing is, I used to always talk about this, and I got a lot of significant pushback from farmers, but then I put it into an app and now I don't get any pushback. So apparently it was my delivery, and now they believe the app, not me. All right, questions?
So Dr. Conley, there's kind of a comment and then a question that have come in through the chat. The first kind of says, there were several articles published last week highlighting variable rate soybean seeding, and a Nebraska grower grew 148.8 bushels per acre with an average seeding rate of 80,000. And
Yep.
we used to plant at 160.
Yep. So here's some cool things that happen. So again, breeders try to take credit for everything, but I'll give them a little bit of credit here. So what breeders have effectively done over, again, the last 30 years, if they've added 3 times the amount of yield on branches. Okay. So if you're out there, you're planting your normal 160,000, 150,000, whatever, you typically have a main stem, and they have advanced yield on that main stem as well. Obviously, that's what's driving this yield gain. However, in these situations where we have a lower population and we start seeing branching on these soybean plants, they've effectively added 3 times the amount of yield over the last 30 years on those branches. So what we've basically and effectively done is cut the yield penalty for low stands in half. And that's why today we can make these recommendations. A, we're planting earlier, so we're putting more nodes on it on a per acre basis. And B, we are effectively have more branching and more seeds in those branching that's really overcame the penalty for thin stands. So it's actually been a pretty cool, like, multi-level or dimensional approach to why we're seeing these yield increases, earlier planting and more branching and more seeds on those branches. That's a great question. So that's the kind of the physiology behind why we're seeing what we're seeing.
Yeah, that's really good good insight there. The next question kind of you touched on some of this already. It said, have the genetics changed, which you touched on, or are we doing a better job of planting soybeans and using seed treatments, etc.? What are your thoughts there, Dr. Conley?
Is yes good enough?
Okay.
No, I think no, it is true. I mean, I think we're doing a better job with placement. I remember when it was even like 15 years ago, seed was relatively cheap, and I had to retrain my own technician because they were, worked in the 80s where the recommendation was that you needed to see this is when we were using drills. You needed to see at least a few seeds on the top of the ground. That's how you knew you had it on average right. So we've moved a long ways from, counting a few seeds on the top of the ground to precision seed placement and depth. The addition of seed treatments, specifically in these early plantings, help us maintain our population. So yeah, I mean, it's been a systems approach, but that's a great point.
Yeah. So the next question is kind of a clarification follow-up question. So even if poor yield environments on tough hill ground / timber soils in Missouri, you're still recommending, as long as there are 50,000 plants per acre, it is not worth replanting? And does it make a difference in 15 or 30-inch rows?
Yeah, that's a good point. And thank you for that clarification. I would say in those, what I recommend in our tough, like, knolls up here is I would push that up. I would push that up to probably, again, this is just a wag, a wild blank guess, but usually what we start seeing is an extra 30 to 40,000 seeds. So that would put it in that 80 to 90,000 threshold in those type of soils before I would do anything. Usually because we have these clay knolls, we have these sandy, points. Usually I want growers putting at least another 30 to 40,000 seeds in those areas versus some of the better ground. So that's a good point of clarification, and thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah. So the next question is really kind of another clarification. And can you touch on, uniform versus sporadic stand issues accounted for?
Yeah. So I've been chasing this ghost for years, and in soybean, on average, we still haven't gotten our populations below how do I want to say this simply? I mean, if as long as you have 80,000 plants per acre, I don't see any differences between. I don't see precision seeding at populations of 80,000 seeds per acre or above. So if we see if you always get 80,000 plants per acre out there, they don't have to be a picket fence. All right. And that's just what we've seen. It might be a little different. Again, you would expect a more of a tougher terrain and tougher ground where you might get some drought stress to see that. But all the plots that we've done and we've gone and tried to do, we've done it. We've went out there with a precision planter down to 80,000, and we've gone out there with basically a control spill down to 80,000, and I don't see any differences. I mean, if you're down under 60 or 50, that's where we might start seeing a break point. But down to 80, I haven't seen it, because remember, these soybeans, they have that phenotypic plasticity. They're unlike corn. But I mean, you might have some experience down there, Jody, or the rest of the Asgrow team that I don't have, but that's what we're seeing. That's a good question.
Well, good. Well, that kind of takes care of all the questions that are currently in the chat. And I think in the interest of time, we'll probably kind of keep moving.
So that's my question, Jody. How much more time do you want to give me? Because I can spend 5 minutes or 5 more hours. So I just need an idea.
Sure. If you want to take another 5 minutes or so, I think that would be
perfect. Yep, I can tell the same story in 5 minutes or 5 hours. So let me sort out what we want to do here. I'm not going to bore you with row spacing, so I'll give you the quick and dirty. Basically, if you're in a low yield environment, you still want narrow rows, and by narrow rows, I'm talking 20 inches or less. If you're in a high yield environment and you are a farmer that has irrigation or high yield potential and you're planting early, I don't see any differences between 30s, 15s, 20s. That's kind of disappeared. So again, I'll share this publication with Jody. You can post it. You can get really into the nuances. But we do see a break point is double crop. Obviously, double crop beans, you're going to want those beans narrow, as narrow as you can get them, for basically to increase your effective node number and to get the canopy, to throw a canopy out there to shade the ground and decrease evapotranspiration as quickly as possible. But I'm not going to bore you with that. Oh, blah, 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 blah. What do I want to talk about here? I think I'm going to just blow through all this stuff because it's blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to bore you with that. Here's one thing about nutrients. I think that's, if we look at, agronomy 101, obviously feeding that soybean crop is critical. So if you go to our website, and here's this Badger Bean website, or you can get it to my coolbean.info. Here's a soybean crop uptake and removal rate calculator that we developed. Basically, you put your yield potential in there. And what this tells you on a per acre basis, per bushel base. So I put in 80 bushels per acre. So an 80 bushel soybean crop will remove basically 275 pounds of nitrogen, roughly 60 pounds of P2O5, and roughly 100 pounds of K2O. So this kind of gives farmers a sense of what that removal is. In Wisconsin, we actually see a lot of our soybean stover is baled up for bedding for our dairy industry. And I'm 100% sure that farmers are not paying attention to what that removal is. And that's happening in parts of Missouri as well, some of the beef industry, they might be doing that. Just make sure you pay attention. If you are a farmer selling soybean stover off the field, that you're getting enough money to basically pay for the fertilizer that you're removing in stover, because it's a significant amount of potassium as well. So with that, again, it's a final reminder. Here's my website, coolbean.info. There's my Twitter @BadgerBean, and then I write a blog during the growing season, the Soy Report. So with that, I will pause. If there's any questions now, Jody. If not, I'll tune back in at 11 to 15 and if for any final statements.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Conley. Really appreciate your time. And it's always, interesting to see the different kinds of research that's going on out there, across the country. And I know we have a lot of access to things on Google and Facebook and Twitter, but, to have you here presenting your data, it's really nice to see, and appreciate you taking the time. So